Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper and today I want to tell you the story of this painting by Jean-François Millet. It's this one called The Gleaners, and it was first exhibited in 1857. Today it is probably his most popular picture. You might call it one of his greatest hits. So it might come as a surprise that in 1857 it wasn't received well at all. It did not get that many very good reviews. It was seen as, well, a bad picture by many of the visitors of the Salon in Paris. And that's because of its subject matter. What we see is a group of gleaners, 3 women who are picking up leftovers on a field that has been harvested. And they are extremely poor. And that, as a subject, wasn't really appreciated by the visitors of the Salon, who were mostly middle class, upper middle class people. What they wanted to see, what they considered to be real art, was heroic poses of historical figures or mythological figures or biblical figures, stories from great literature or that sort of thing. Just a few peasants being poor, they said, was not a subject for art. And they would always accuse realist painters of having a political agenda in their paintings, that they were left-wing or socialist, because they would paint these peasants or workers that did hard labor and would place them so obviously on their paintings. Like, for instance, this one by Gustave Courbet, which sadly you can't see anymore because it was destroyed during World War II. But it was a famous one of stone breakers that had been exhibited about a decade before, 8 years to be exact. It actually won a few prizes in 1849 at the Paris Salon. But it shows people doing back-breaking work on a quite large scale, because it's a pretty big picture. And many reviewers would say that that sort of size of a picture would be reserved for, I don't know, Hercules doing one of his works instead of an ordinary person doing hard work. Most of the realists would say that they were not politically engaged, but if you went out of the circle of the bourgeoisie of Paris, this is what you would see. You would see people hard at work. But that sort of explanation doesn't really work for this picture by Millet, because in this case we see 3 women who are gleaners, as I said. They are the poorest of the poorest in the countryside, basically beggars. And we see them up front, while other hard-working people who are also doing back-breaking hard work are all the way in the back. You can see this sort of army of workers in the background, and they are doing the actual harvesting of the field. And they are picking up all this wheat and they're stacking it up on hay stacks and on hay wains and whatever, so it can be carted off and processed, I suppose. You can also see there's a supervisor on a horse there, although it's a pretty small horse, maybe a mule or whatever. He is looking on, seeing if the work is done well. And you can see that it's a rich harvest with all these stacks that you can see there. And there's a big farmhouse in the distance as well, showing us that whoever owns this farm is pretty wealthy. And so what we see in the background is hard work, but hard work that pays off. What we see up front is hard work that doesn't pay off that much. Because gleaners are people who have absolutely nothing. They are the people who are allowed to come into a harvested field and then pick up the leftovers. So whatever they didn't pick up, these little kernels that are still there and little bits of wheat. And that's how they try to make a living. It's actually an ancient right. It's something that's mentioned in various places in the Bible, for instance. And according to biblical law, farmers were supposed to leave even a corner of their fields unharvested for poor people to take advantage of. And besides biblical law, in much of Europe it was actual law that you had to allow people to glean on your field after the harvest. And even if it wasn't written down in the law, it was usually considered bad luck not to have them, because that would mean bad luck for your next harvest. And it's actually a subject that seems to be close to Millet's heart, because, well, he had moved to the countryside to Barbizon. He's one of the founders of the Barbizon school, of course. And there he started painting these rural scenes of farm life, often of people planting or harvesting something. But he had this particular fondness of painting Gleaners, because this is a painting of the most famous of all Gleaners, called Ruth. In the biblical book of Ruth, it's this story about a woman who is not from Israel. She is a Moabite, a kingdom sort of next door, and she had been married to a man from Israel, and he died, and then his mother, her mother-in-law, decided to move back to Israel and allowed Ruth to stay behind if she wanted to. But Ruth decided to come along with her mother-in-law and said that she would live where she lived, worship the God that she worshipped, and be buried where she was buried. So they moved back to where her mother-in-law had come from, to an area near a farm where a man named Boaz lived. And Boaz apparently was a cousin of her late husband. And they went to that farm and they became gleaners. They cleared the field after the harvest to make a living. And the mother-in-law then said to Ruth that she should sleep with Boaz and compel him to marry her, which had something to do with the inheritance staying within the family. But kind of beside the point. The point really is that Boaz turned out to be an honorable man. He did not take advantage of her. He first allowed him to glean. I'm not sure if that's a real verb, but I'm going to use it anyway. And then when she came to him at night, he did not take advantage of her, let her sleep there, but that's it. And they found out if there was not someone else who was supposed to marry her first, and then decided to marry her. In this painting, which is called Rest During the Harvest, or Ruth and Boaz, we see them coming in, well, falling in love, I suppose. And it was made only a few years before the famous Gleaners was made. But even though that this painting has a direct link to, well, Ruth, the Gleaner, the Gleaners as we know it, the famous one, this one, doesn't seem to be about Ruth, not about the biblical story. Because we don't see Boaz and the connection between the two. What we do see is these three women who are desperately poor. We know this because this is the work they are doing. They are clearly doing this back-breaking work. It's hard work, leaning over and searching for just little bits of, well, food. And we can also see the little stacks of wheat that they have accumulated, and we see that on the side. So all that work they're doing for such a small reward. What we can also see when we look closely at them is that they're actually three very different women. There are three different ages. Because if you look at the one all the way on the left, she's bent over with one hand on her back, and she's picking up little bits and pieces, and then she can just move her hand over to the other hand so she can hold the various strains in one hand. She's actually younger than the other ones. And we can see that by her hands that are younger than the other hands, and also by her pose, because her back is still up to this. The woman next to her is bent over as well, and she has this bag in front of her in a sort of an apron, I suppose. So whatever she picks up, she can put in there. That means that she can lean her hands on her knees to relieve her back, which is the sort of back pain you start getting when you're a little bit older. And then the third woman, she's standing upright. And that's because she only bends over when she finds something. Because for her, bending over is much more painful. So she's most likely older. And if you compare their hands, you can also see that difference there. And you can also see they also have their hair tied back, but only the youngest one has taken care to have a flap of fabric over her neck so she doesn't burn her neck. She's the one who's used to being bent over the entire day, so the sun shines directly on her neck. Now, as I said before, this painting was not received well by the audiences, who thought that this was too much of an heroic stance for the very, very poor, and that it was a socialist painting. Well, in this case, of course, with the contrast of these very poor women who are all the way at the front, contrasted by hard work in the background, you could be forgiven for thinking that. It also came at a time when farmers started to charge people for the right to glean. So they would ask them money for picking up whatever they had left on the ground, which seems like a pretty unpleasant thing to do to people. Now, even though this painting received a few negative reviews at first, he did sell it. There was a portion of the audiences of the buying public that bought his paintings, and for a reasonable price apparently, because there were never any complaints about it. And his paintings usually sold, so he was a successful, financially successful painter anyway. What happened in his case actually is that often his paintings were resold after a decade or whatever and fetched much higher prices. And his paintings led to French legislation that says that if you have a painting of a living painter and you sell it, you have to give a percentage of the sales price to the original artist. Which I think France is pretty unique in to have that. This painting ended up in the collection of the Louvre at first and was then moved to the Musée d'Orsay when they founded the Musée d'Orsay, where you can still see it in Paris. And I would recommend going there and seeing it for yourself, because of course it's much better up close. And they have this wonderful collection of his larger and smaller paintings. This is one of the fairly large ones. He has many much smaller ones as well, and they're, well, really worth checking out if you're there. Besides, Musée d'Orsay is brilliant and it's just across the river from the Louvre, so and of course Paris is, well, it's hardly considered a punishment to be there. So you have to go there, but before you do, you of course have to like this video if you enjoyed it, and perhaps even subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And I'd like to thank you very much for watching. See you again soon. Bye.